Okay, great. So now I guess because we only have about 3 weeks left of the course, including this one, so two more. Uh, I have been thinking perhaps it's time to kind of come to the theory, to the skeleton of the theory of historical materialism. What is historical materialism at the end? Because if we're talking about Marx's materialism, then we are really talking about already we've been talking about historical materialism. So what is that? How could we summarize that? How could we explain that? Part of the job is to be able to explain these complex issues, theories, without oversimplifying them, but in a way that we could understand. And this is, in this case, especially a challenge because we're not just talking about theory in terms of a hypothesis. We're rather talking about both history, Marx's philosophy of history, how history supposedly work and evolve, but also it has all these other dimensions, so of course social, political, and so on. And it has implications in terms of the entire philosophical tradition, the Western philosophical tradition. It has very direct implications most of the time against so-called world religions. And Engels talks about, he when he talks about world religions, remember he included Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. With Buddhism, it is, I would say it is arguable to include it in that class of religions, but his point still, I think, is valid because what he's talking about is also metaphysics in that sense. What happened to metaphysics? And that's where I want to start, metaphysics. So again, kind of contextualizing Marx's materialism and historical materialism historically in that sense, and then move to the actual theory, like how to imagine the theory in a way that could work more as a formula to remember, but not like a rigid kind of identity of things in the world, not that in that sense, because that's the whole point. Okay, yeah. So what Engels says, and this I found these writings very useful, but he was also, a funny writer. Let's face it. For example, when he talks about Feuerbach's, because Feuerbach in a way could never kind of emancipate himself from the religious, let's say spider net, almost, even in his materialism. Because he did start as a student of theology. And then it seems it comes back in 44, right? And that's what Engels is referring back to. So he does admit that Feuerbach was a giant thinker, and he was pushed out of universities and intellectual circles and so on by the dominant social and political system at the time in Germany. But he also recognized that Feuerbach really kind of couldn't make the leap, let's say, to the revolutionary, say, consciousness about history. He realizes some premises, but it seems those premises really didn't become part of Feuerbach's theory. What does that mean? For example, Engels says Feuerbach realized that. He mentions things like that. If you are hungry, then you wouldn't be thinking about, say, ethical questions and so on. So he saw that. In a way, he sensed the connection, but he didn't make the leap. So that's not theory. It just didn't mean much. But also, Feuerbach kind of makes another turn back to religiosity and sentimentalism and whatnot. So when Feuerbach, for example, talks about whatever universal love, and that I want to revisit because it is still around under different names, New Ageism and, let's love all each other, the positive vibe, holding hands, all of us, which I truly, sorry, but find disgusting. If for nothing else, what if the person I'm holding their hand is a fascist? Why should I love this schmuck? What is the actual ethical point in this? So it is still around, just universal love, if we are positive and love everyone, things will change. No, things will not change. That discourse is part of the problem of covering up the actual inequalities and the actual illusions and their effects on social and political life. So anyway, I want to come to this sentence at the end of the paragraph where Engels talks about Feuerbach's kind of new religion, and so he starts talking about love, and here's how he ends that paragraph. Engels writes, at this point, the last relic of the revolutionary character disappears from his philosophy, his being Feuerbach's, leaving only the old Kant column, love one another, fall into each other's arms, regardless of distinctions of sex or estate, a universal orgy of reconciliation. So Engels was really aware of the fundamental problem with that kind of moral discourse. And this is one of the hardest points to communicate when teaching Marxism. They're like making the point that Marx and Engels were not interested in, say, philosophy of morality, for example, or ethics. And it obviously, because we are, trained to think in terms of these false dualities, people might think, some of us might think, okay, they are against the moral whatever discourse or education, therefore they are immoral. No, of course not. That is a false duality. What they are criticizing is the fundamental assumption in ethics that there are certain things that are good regardless of time and space, right? Now, if I make the same claim and under the name of postmodernism, it goes fine, everyone is happy. But if I say, actually, Marx and Engels made this point that you can't have a principle or rule of ethical good that would work for all times and places, then there is a problem. As you know, and we talked about that. And the problem has to do, of course, with the long history of criminalization of Marx and Marxism. Okay. So, and this takes me back, of course, to the first point, which is metaphysics. So the Marxian school of thought is fundamentally against metaphysics, precisely because metaphysics is built on a historicization of knowledge itself, right? So what is truth? It is regardless what is truth. It is regardless to basically all social and historical circumstances. But truth is a product of those social and historical circumstances, right? So there is then a fundamental fallacy in the entire field. Now, that field is, of course, like all other fields, was advanced under theology for a very long time. But then when God starts to die, basically, right? You have the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and religion kind of loses a lot of its prior hegemony. Then we have, that's what we are talking about, that era. What happens then? So certain other classes become dominant, right? Namely, bourgeoisie becomes dominant in the industrial societies. So what happens then, there's a shift of which religion, which sect, and how. But even with the Enlightenment, when you have secular philosophers, it's still not quite a full emancipation from that religious domination. And in fact, metaphysics continues to survive in philosophy. And that is a problem. It's a problem for both Marx and Engels, yeah? So he has some arguments, again, about world religions, and it's a critique of Feuerbach, that Feuerbach thought, these world religions are so important in terms of human history, which comes from Hegel, but of course Engels refutes that argument. And he says that, they make the point about religion. He says, then he elaborates, Engels elaborates about the point in relation to world religions and so on. But let's leave that aside. What is important now to, again, focus on metaphysics and why that is a problem at this point. And here's the basic line. I want to put it in the following terms. So what you have in the Enlightenment is the end of an era, obviously, or the beginning, more accurately, beginning of a new era. Before the Enlightenment, we were living in a finished world, right? The world was complete, was done. There were entities, there were living beings, and of course there was the creator. And these things have their identities, and it was over, done. Right? There was a motion, of course, but the motion was circular, right? So when you go back to that system of truth, that regime of truth before the Enlightenment, it's a whole different universe people were living in. It's more about, say, resemblance, and of course the perfection of creation as a whole, and then reflections of the cosmos on the kind of more micro levels, right? And all that is beautifully explained in Foucault. But Foucault doesn't do it necessarily under the name of kind of a Marxist rereading of history. He, of course, his method, as some of you might know, is more what he called genealogy and archaeology of knowledge and how that works. But the point is that if you even look at paintings from the Dark Ages, you usually have, what do you have? You have like kind of an unfolding universe, literally unfolding, like each part is kind of exact reflection of another part. And then there are the macro levels of reflections, resemblance, and whatnot. That is over with the Enlightenment. Another world is born. Now we live in a universe that is unfinished, that are composed of a space itself that is evolving, and everything in it is evolving. And this is the age of of course, the discovery of all these fields of knowledge. That's why Engels talks about, the importance of what happens in biology, in geology, and so on. Right? But the point is that, okay, now we are at a point where, of course, this is now evolution is it is not anymore something you believe or you don't believe in, almost, right? And that is the point. This is also the point where, right, late 1800s, where Copernicus finally, after 300 years, is being accepted. And that's a fascinating point, because if you think about Marxism in that sense, Marxism itself, people who think, okay, Marxism is over after so many whatever, more than a century, almost 2 centuries, didn't work, it's behind us. Not really. Remember, like Copernicus' theory, more, I would say, less challenging to realize, because it's more kind of definitive scientific formula. It took 300 years, more than 300 years, and still there are people around who actually refuted, supposedly rejected. They have conferences, like this is not a joke. People who think that the earth is flat, they have conferences. They look like any other conference, by the way, which tells you any other conference might be very misleading on appearance. They might be actually advancing a lot of bullshit. Like many textbooks as well. Except this is something we know for a fact that is a terrible myth. But they do have conferences, speakers, all the stuff, the ties and everything. People come together and drink their coffees and they act like intellectuals. They do believe and argue and write papers about the flatness of Earth, right? So it is not too late for it. In fact, it is just about, the right time is just about to start for realizing how Marxism is valid, is sound. But even saying that is funny. I mean, personally, when I'm asked, oh, are you a Marxist? My favorite answer would be something like, yeah, and something even more dangerous, in case you ever know, I'm a Newtonian. I actually believe that Newton's laws are true. It's very easy to prove that one. It's really the same thing in many ways. But that I'll explain in a bit, in what ways. But one quick story. Once in Norway, a friend, a very nice friend, said that there's this philosopher you should meet and so on, former Marxist. And the moment, I don't know what my friend told that philosopher about me, but the intentions were good. So the moment we meet, he goes on, oh, Marxism is like a religion and historical materialism is like a religion, it's all dogma. And I was a little surprised, it was one of those times, you just say, this is hopeless, just enjoy your beer and stuff, which is usually not me. But within about 5 minutes, some other subject came up, and he was talking about the big difference between the Scandinavian countries and the US in terms of, prisons and the effect of prisons. The argument he was making was very plain, we all know. When you have less poverty, more kind of a better degree of social justice, you would have less violence, crime, and so on and so forth. Basic, right? Look at the US, look at parts of Europe, that's the clear, and empirical evidence that shows you that. And my only answer was, well, very, very basic, I just looked at him and I said, now, who's the Marxist now? It's just as basic as that. That's not the whole thing, but that is, if you believe that much, whether you know it or not, whether you have allergy or not towards Marxism, that's a Marxist argument, basically. Right? In other words, people's conditions of life basically determine everything. Right? So obviously, if you have more poverty, you would have more violence, crime, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. It's very basic. It's not about moral values. It's not about people in certain places being evil or violent or having a weird culture and like to be enslaved or like to kill or like wars, but we nice, whatever, Europeans, we have a different, I hear this every day. And it's funny, to be an educator in the West and be brown and then listen to this kind of argument. We value, okay, it's a cultural difference, we value individual freedoms, and that's just the new way of, how racism works. It basically says we have individuals capable of making their own choices, other societies don't, because they are ruled by collective culture. And that is complete nonsense, complete bullshit. What is ignored in all this, of course, is life conditions, right? And it gets more complicated, the international division of labor and all the consequences of that. Yeah? Now, I hate to cut this part on Engels short, because it's really a very rich review of many parts of Marx's philosophy and his philosophy, of course. But I want to move to both presenting now and quick defense of historical materialism. What is historical